The flames danced against the darkening sky as Ethan North spurred his Mustang across the dusty plain, his heart pounding with the same fury as the hooves beneath him. The church bell tower of Douglas, Arizona Territory, was now barely visible through the thick black smoke that billowed into the twilight sky of 1885. He had seen the blaze from 5 miles out while returning from a cattle drive, and the distant screams carried on the hot desert wind told him everything he needed to know. "Faster, Diablo!" Ethan shouted, leaning low over his horse's neck. The powerful black Mustang responded, stretching into a full gallop as they raced toward the burning church that sat on the edge of town. The dry Arizona summer had turned everything to kindling. 3 months without rain meant disaster when fire took hold, and as Ethan drew closer, he could see flames engulfing the small wooden structure, bright orange tongues licking up the sides of the white steeple. Sheriff Wilkins and a line of townsmen were frantically passing buckets of water from the nearby horse trough, their efforts seeming pitiful against the inferno. The lawman spotted Ethan and waved him down frantically. "North, thank God. The Sunday school room in back, there's women trapped." Ethan slid from his saddle before Diablo had fully stopped, his boots sending up dust as he landed. "How many?" 4 or 5 schoolteacher and some mothers setting up for tomorrow's service. The sheriff's face was streaked with soot and sweat, back doors blocked by fallen beams. Ethan pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth as his eyes scanned the building. The front entrance was a wall of flame, but he spotted a side window where the fire seemed less intense. "Keep working the bucket line," he ordered, already moving toward the burning structure. "You're insane, North," someone called out. "The whole thing's coming down." Ethan ignored them, racing around to the side of the church. The heat hit him like a physical wall as he approached the window. Inside, he could see nothing but smoke and occasional flickers of orange flame. With one swift move, he yanked off his duster and wrapped it around his arm before smashing the glass. "Hello," he shouted into the inferno. "Anyone in there? Call out." For a moment, there was nothing. Then faintly, "Help us. We're in the back room." Ethan cleared the remaining glass from the frame and, without hesitation, hoisted himself through the window. The smoke inside was thick and choking, forcing him to crouch low where the air was marginally clearer. The pews to his right were already ablaze, and overhead, the wooden beams groaned ominously. Following the wall, he made his way toward the back of the church, where a narrow hallway led to the Sunday school room. The floor beneath his boots was hot enough to feel through the leather. "Keep calling out," he shouted, coughing as smoke filled his lungs. "Here." The voice was closer now, and Ethan could make out a door at the end of the hall. When he reached it, he found it jammed. From inside, he heard coughing and frightened voices. "Stand back," he yelled, before ramming his shoulder against the wood. It took 3 attempts before the door splintered inward. Inside the small room, 5 women huddled by the far wall, handkerchiefs pressed to their faces. One of them, a young woman with ash-streaked blonde hair, was supporting an older woman who appeared to be overcome by smoke. "This way," Ethan commanded, moving to help them. "We need to go now. The roof won't hold much longer." The blonde woman looked up, her blue eyes wide with terror and determination. "Mrs. Patterson can't walk," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the circumstances. Ethan scooped the older woman into his arms. "Lead the others," he told the blonde. "Stay low and follow me." They moved as quickly as possible through the burning church, the flames now consuming most of the main sanctuary. Twice they had to change course as burning debris fell in their path. The heat was unbearable, searing Ethan's skin through his clothes, but he pressed on, the unconscious woman in his arms and the 4 others close behind. When they reached the broken window, Ethan passed Mrs. Patterson through to waiting hands outside. One by one, the women followed, helped by townspeople who had gathered. The blonde teacher was last, turning to Ethan with a grateful look before climbing through. Just as Ethan prepared to follow, a thunderous crack came from above. He looked up to see a massive ceiling beam, engulfed in flames, breaking free. With no time to escape through the window, he threw himself forward, rolling under a pew as the beam crashed down where he had stood moments before. "Mr. North," he heard the blonde woman call from outside. The fire was everywhere now, surrounding him, cutting off the window. Ethan crawled on his belly toward the front of the church, where the entrance doors had stood. They were gone now, burned away, leaving an archway of flame. With no other choice, Ethan wrapped his arms around his head, took a deep breath, and ran straight through the wall of fire. The shock of cool evening air hit him as he stumbled out onto the church steps, his shirt smoldering. Hands reached for him, pulling him farther from the building, dousing him with water from the buckets meant for the fire. Behind him, with a sound like the end of the world, the church steeple collapsed inward, sending a geyser of sparks into the darkening sky. "Ethan, good Lord, man." Sheriff Wilkins was there, helping him to sit on the ground. "I thought you were done for." Ethan couldn't speak yet, his lungs burning, his throat raw from smoke. He looked up to see the 5 women he'd rescued being attended to by the town doctor. The blonde teacher was staring at him, her blue eyes reflecting the orange glow of the burning church. "He saved us," she was saying to the doctor. "He rode through the fire to save us." The doctor moved toward Ethan, but he waved the man away. "Check the women," he managed to rasp. "Faith Garrett hasn't let me do more than look at her hands," the doctor replied, nodding toward the blonde. "Stubborn as her father was." Ethan's eyes met Faith's across the chaos of the scene: the burning church, the frantic townspeople, the night sky ablaze with sparks. Something passed between them, something neither of them could name in that moment, but both would remember long after the embers had cooled. By morning, the church was nothing but a blackened skeleton. Ethan, having refused to go to the doctor's office, had spent the night helping to ensure the fire didn't spread to nearby buildings. His hands were bandaged where he'd burned them on the window frame, his face smudged with soot, his shirt ruined. He stood contemplating the ruins when he sensed someone beside him. Faith Garrett had approached quietly, 2 steaming cups in her hands. She offered one to him. "Coffee," she said simply. "You look like you need it." Ethan accepted the cup, nodding his thanks. Up close, in the clear morning light, he could see her more clearly than in the chaos of the previous evening. She was younger than he'd initially thought, perhaps 25, with delicate features and those striking blue eyes. Her blonde hair was neatly pinned back now, though a few strands had escaped to frame her face. "How are the others?" he asked, his voice still rough from the smoke. "Mrs. Patterson is at the doctor's, but she'll recover. The others have minor burns and some coughing, but we were lucky." She paused, looking at him intently. "Thanks to you." Ethan shrugged uncomfortably. "Anyone would have done the same." Faith shook her head. "No, Mr. North, not anyone would have ridden toward a fire when others were running away. Not anyone would have come into a burning building without knowing if they could get out again." "Ethan," he said. "Pardon, my name, it's Ethan. Mr. North makes me sound like my father." A small smile touched her lips. "Ethan, then. I'm Faith Garrett. I teach at the school." "I know who you are, Miss Garrett. Douglas isn't that big a town. And yet we've never spoken before yesterday." Ethan looked away back at the burned church. "I don't come to town much. My ranch keeps me busy." "The North Ranch," Faith nodded. 10 miles west, I believe." He raised an eyebrow, surprised she knew this. "Douglas isn't that big a town," she echoed with the hint of a smile. Despite his exhaustion, Ethan found himself wanting to smile back. There was something about her steady gaze that made him feel both uncomfortable and oddly at ease. "They're saying it was lightning," she continued, gesturing to the church ruins. "From that dry storm that passed through yesterday. Strange place for lightning to strike." Faith's expression clouded. "You think it wasn't an accident?" Before Ethan could respond, Sheriff Wilkins approached, his weary face suggesting he hadn't slept at all. "North, Miss Garrett." He nodded to each of them. "Town council's meeting at noon to discuss rebuilding. Thought you both might want to know." "I'll be there," Faith assured him. "And you, North?" the sheriff asked. "We could use your input." Ethan hesitated. He rarely involved himself in town affairs, preferring the solitude of his ranch and the straightforward company of cattle to the complications of people. "I'm not much for meetings," he began. "He'll be there," Faith interrupted, giving Ethan a look that brooked no argument. "Won't you, Mr. North? After all, without a church, where will you attend Sunday services?" Ethan almost pointed out that he hadn't set foot in church since his mother's funeral 5 years ago, but something in Faith's determined expression stopped him. "Fine," he conceded. "Noon." The sheriff nodded, satisfied, and moved on to spread the word to others. "I don't recall agreeing to let you answer for me, Miss Garrett," Ethan said once the sheriff was out of earshot. Faith sipped her coffee, unperturbed. "Consider it payment for saving my life. One town meeting seems a small price." Despite himself, Ethan felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward. "You drive a hard bargain for someone who was just rescued from a burning building." "I'm a schoolteacher, Mr. North. We're notoriously difficult to impress." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Ethan to wonder what exactly had just happened. The town meeting was held in the saloon, the only building in Douglas large enough to accommodate most of its citizens. Ethan arrived precisely at noon, having gone home to change his clothes and check on his ranch hands. He stood at the back, uncomfortable with the press of bodies and the noise of multiple conversations. Mayor Harrison called the meeting to order, and the room gradually quieted. "Friends, we've suffered a terrible loss," he began. "Our church, built by the hands of our own townspeople 15 years ago, is gone. But Douglas has faced hardship before, and we've always rebuilt. Today, we begin that process." There were murmurs of agreement throughout the room. Ethan spotted Faith sitting near the front, her back straight, attention focused on the mayor. "First," the mayor continued, "we should recognize the heroism of one of our own. Ethan North rode into that inferno and saved 5 lives yesterday. I think that deserves our gratitude." All eyes turned to Ethan, who shifted uncomfortably as applause filled the room. He nodded once in acknowledgement, wishing he could disappear. The meeting proceeded to practical matters where services would be held temporarily, how funds would be raised for rebuilding, who would lead the construction efforts. Ethan half listened, his mind drifting to the work waiting for him back at the ranch. "I have a question," Faith's clear voice cut through Ethan's thoughts. "Sheriff, have you determined exactly how the fire started?" The sheriff cleared his throat. "As I told some of you earlier, it appears to have been lightning from that dry storm." "With respect, Sheriff, I was inside that church when the fire began. It didn't start in the steeple or roof where lightning would strike. It started at the back door, almost as if—" She hesitated. "Almost as if what, Miss Garrett?" the mayor prompted. "Almost as if someone had said it deliberately." The saloon erupted in shocked murmurs. Ethan straightened, suddenly paying full attention. "That's a serious accusation," the sheriff warned. "Do you have any evidence?" "Only what I saw," Faith replied steadily. "And the fact that the back door was somehow blocked from the outside. We couldn't open it, which is why we were trapped." Ethan stepped forward. "She's right. When I got to them, they were in the Sunday school room. If the back door hadn't been blocked, they could have escaped that way." The sheriff frowned. "You're suggesting arson." "I'm suggesting you investigate more thoroughly before deciding it was lightning," Ethan replied. More murmurs filled the room, some angry, some frightened. The idea that someone had deliberately set fire to their church with people inside was almost unthinkable. "Very well," the mayor said, raising his hands for quiet. "Sheriff Wilkins will investigate. In the meantime, we'll proceed with plans for rebuilding." As the meeting continued, Ethan found himself studying Faith Garrett with new interest. She wasn't just a schoolteacher. She was observant, determined, and unafraid to speak her mind. Qualities that were rare enough in men in these parts, let alone women. When the meeting concluded, Ethan made his way toward her, weaving through the dispersing crowd. "Miss Garrett," he said as he reached her, "you made quite an impression." She looked up at him, her expression serious. "I only said what needed saying." "Something's not right about that fire, Mr. North. I can feel it." "I believe you," he replied, "and I'd like to help find out what really happened." Faith studied him for a moment, as if gauging his sincerity. "Why?" It was a simple question, but Ethan found himself without a simple answer. Why did he care about a church fire in a town he barely visited? Why was he suddenly willing to involve himself in what would surely be a complicated and possibly dangerous investigation? "Because I rode into that fire to save lives," he said finally. "And I'd like to know who put those lives in danger in the first place." Faith nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Where do we start?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Yes, Mr. North, It was my observation that raised the question, and I was inside when the fire began. You'll need my help." Ethan wanted to argue, to tell her this wasn't a job for a schoolteacher, but he suspected it would be pointless. Besides, she was right, her perspective would be valuable. "All right," he conceded, "but we do this carefully. If someone deliberately set that fire, they won't take kindly to us asking questions." "I'm not afraid," Faith said, lifting her chin slightly. "Maybe you should be," Ethan replied quietly. "Meet me at the church ruins tomorrow at dawn. We'll see what we can find before the rebuilding starts." Faith agreed, and they parted ways, neither realizing that they had just set in motion events that would change both their lives forever. True to her word, Faith was waiting at the burned church when Ethan arrived the next morning, the sun just beginning to lighten the eastern horizon. She wore a simple dark blue dress, her hair braided and tucked under a practical bonnet. She had apparently come prepared for dirty work, as she also wore a sturdy apron and gloves. "Good morning, Mr. North," she greeted him. "Miss Garrett." He dismounted from Diablo, tying the horse to a nearby post. "You're punctual. A necessary virtue for a teacher." She turned to face the blackened skeleton of the church. "Where should we begin? You said the fire started at the back door. Let's look there." They picked their way carefully through the ruins, mindful of unstable charred beams and hot spots that might still linger beneath the ashes. The smell of burnt wood hung heavy in the morning air. The back of the church was less damaged than the front, which had borne the brunt of the fire's fury. The door itself was gone, but the frame remained, blackened but intact. "Here," Faith said, pointing to a spot on the ground outside the door. "Look at the burn pattern." Ethan crouched down, studying the scorched earth. She was right, the burn marks were more intense outside the door than inside, suggesting the fire had indeed started there and burned inward. "Good eye," he murmured. "Definitely not lightning." Faith knelt beside him, her skirts carefully gathered to avoid the soot. "And look here," she said, pointing to metal fragments near the door frame. "These aren't from the door hinges. They're different." Ethan picked up one of the twisted metal pieces, turning it over in his hand. "This is from a padlock," he said grimly. "Someone locked the door from the outside." Faith's eyes widened. "That's why we couldn't open it. But who would do such a thing? And why?" Before Ethan could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both look up. Sheriff Wilkins was riding toward them, his expression unreadable. "I thought I might find you two here," he said as he dismounted. "Finding anything interesting?" Ethan straightened, the metal fragment still in his hand. "You could say that. Someone locked the back door with a padlock before setting the fire." The sheriff's eyes narrowed as he took the piece of metal from Ethan. "That's a serious accusation, North." "It's not an accusation, it's a fact," Faith interjected. "Look at the burn pattern, Sheriff. The fire started out here and burned inward. And those metal pieces are clearly from a padlock, not the original door hardware." Wilkins sighed heavily, suddenly looking older than his 50 years. "I was afraid of this." "You suspected arson?" Ethan asked sharply. "I had my doubts about the lightning story from the beginning, but I needed evidence before I said anything." The sheriff gestured around them. "This town's been through enough trouble without adding a potential murderer to the mix." "But who would want to burn down a church?" Faith asked. "And with people inside?" "That's what I intend to find out," Wilkins replied. "And I'll thank you both to leave the investigating to me from here on out. This is official business now." Ethan exchanged a glance with Faith, seeing his own reluctance mirrored in her eyes. Neither of them was inclined to step back, not after what they'd discovered. "We'll keep out of your way, Sheriff," Ethan said carefully, not quite promising to stop investigating. Wilkins wasn't fooled. "I mean it, North. Miss Garrett is a respected member of this community, and you've earned some goodwill with your heroics. But this isn't a game. If someone was willing to burn down a church with people inside, they won't hesitate to silence anyone getting too close to the truth." "All the more reason for you to have help," Faith pointed out reasonably. The sheriff looked like he wanted to argue further, but instead he just shook his head. "I can see I'm wasting my breath. Just be careful, both of you, and keep me informed of anything you find." After the sheriff left, Ethan and Faith continued their examination of the church ruins. By mid-morning, they had confirmed beyond doubt that the fire had been deliberately set, likely using coal oil as an accelerant. The question remains why. Faith said as they took a break, sitting on a fallen log a short distance from the church. "Why would anyone want to burn down our church?" Ethan was silent for a moment, thinking. "It might not have been about the church itself." "You said you were there with other women, setting up for Sunday school?" Faith nodded. "Mrs. Patterson, who runs the bakery, Mrs. Lopez, the dressmaker, Mrs. Carpenter, the blacksmith's wife, and Miss Wilson, who assists me at the school." "So all prominent women in town," Ethan observed. "Could someone have had a grudge against one of you specifically?" Faith considered this. "It's possible, I suppose, though I can't imagine who would hate any of us enough to commit such a terrible act." "What were you doing there so late? Church services are usually in the morning." "We were preparing for a special children's program," Faith explained, "teaching them about the importance of charity and community. Each child was going to bring something to donate to families in need." Something flickered in Ethan's eyes. "When was this program announced?" "Last Sunday." Reverend Collins made quite a point of it. Faith's eyes widened as she caught his implication. "You think someone objected to the program itself?" "It's a possibility." Ethan stood, offering Faith his hand to help her up. "Who in town might oppose charity for the needy?" Faith accepted his help, her gloved hand small in his. "No one openly, but there has been tension since the railroad decided to run a spur line through Douglas. Land values have increased, and some of the poorer families are struggling to keep their homes." And your charity program might have drawn attention to that inequality, Ethan suggested. Faith nodded slowly. Mr. Campbell at the bank has been particularly aggressive about collecting debts lately, and he's been buying properties all along where the new station is planned. Sounds like we need to learn more about Mr. Campbell's recent activities, Ethan said. But first, let's finish here. I want to be certain we haven't missed anything. They returned to the church ruins, methodically working their way through what remained of the structure. As they searched, Ethan found himself increasingly aware of Faith's presence beside him, her quiet determination, her sharp observations, the delicate scent of lavender that somehow persisted despite the pervasive smell of ash and char. He had known of her before. Of course, everyone in Douglas knew the schoolteacher, but he had never paid her much attention. Now, watching her carefully lift a charred hymnal from the debris, her face intent with concentration, he wondered how he could have overlooked her for so long. "Mr. North," she called, breaking into his thoughts. "Look at this." Ethan moved to her side. She was holding a partially burned piece of paper that had been inside the hymnal. "It's a letter," she said, carefully unfolding it, "addressed to Reverend Collins." Together they read the surviving portions of the letter. "Cannot in good conscience allow this to continue. The moral fabric of our community, those who would take advantage, must stand firm against." The rest was burned away and there was no signature. "Someone objecting to something the Reverend was doing," Ethan mused. "The charity program, perhaps," Faith suggested. "But why not sign their name?" "Because they knew what they were planning," Ethan said grimly. "This might be our first real clue." As the sun climbed higher, they reluctantly agreed to end their search for the day. Faith needed to prepare for school the following day, and Ethan had ranch business that couldn't be neglected any longer. "I'll speak with Mr. Campbell tomorrow," Faith said as they walked back to their horses. "As a depositor at his bank, it won't seem unusual for me to visit." "Be careful," Ethan warned. "Don't let him know what we suspect." "I'm not a fool, Mr. North," Faith replied with a hint of sharpness. "I can be quite discreet when necessary." "I didn't mean to suggest otherwise," Ethan said quickly. "It's just, if he is involved, he's already shown he's willing to kill." Faith's expression softened. "I know, I'll be careful. And what will you do?" "I'll ask around town, see if anyone noticed anything unusual the day of the fire. Someone might have seen something without realizing its importance." They reached their horses, and Ethan helped Faith mount her mare, a gentle sorrel named Penny. Their hands touched briefly in the process, and Ethan was surprised by the jolt of awareness that ran through him. "Until tomorrow, then," Faith said, seemingly unaffected by the moment that had left Ethan momentarily speechless. "Shall we meet at the schoolhouse after classes end? Around 4 o'clock, Ethan nodded. 4 o'clock, he agreed, finding his voice. "Good day, Miss Garrett." "Good day, Mr. North." With a gentle flick of the reins, she guided Penny toward town, leaving Ethan watching her departure with a strange mix of admiration and concern. As he mounted Diablo and headed back to his ranch, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were stepping into something far more dangerous than either of them had initially realized. The fire at the church was no random act of violence. It was calculated, deliberate, and very nearly deadly. Whoever was responsible wouldn't hesitate to strike again if they felt threatened. And yet, despite the danger, Ethan found himself looking forward to 4 o'clock the next day with an anticipation that had little to do with their investigation and everything to do with seeing Faith Garrett again. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of Douglas, a simple white clapboard building with a bell tower that, thankfully, had not shared the church's fate. Ethan arrived precisely at 4, just as the last of the children were leaving for the day, their shouts and laughter filling the afternoon air. Faith was at the door, bidding farewell to her students. She wore a different dress today, a soft green that complemented her fair coloring. Her hair was arranged in the same practical style as the day before, but a few tendrils had escaped to frame her face, softening her appearance. She spotted him and raised a hand in greeting, waiting until the last child had departed before approaching his horse. "Mr. North," she said, looking up at him. "Right on time." Ethan dismounted, tying Diablo to the hitching post. "Any luck with Campbell?" Faith glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Let's talk inside." She led him into the schoolroom, a bright, orderly space with rows of desks facing a larger teacher's desk at the front. Maps and educational charts hung on the walls, and a blackboard displayed neat chalk writing tomorrow's arithmetic lesson. Ethan guessed. Faith closed the door and turned to him. "I visited the bank during my lunch hour. Mr. Campbell was surprisingly accommodating." "Suspiciously so?" Ethan asked, leaning against one of the student desks. "Perhaps." Faith moved to her desk, gathering papers into a neat stack. He asked about the church rebuilding efforts, expressed his shock and sadness about the fire. Then he mentioned, unprompted, that he'd been in Tucson the day of the fire, only returning yesterday morning. Convenient. Yes, though it can likely be verified. More interesting was what his clerk, Mr. Jenkins, told me when Campbell stepped away. Apparently, Campbell has been in meetings with representatives from the railroad, discussing not just the planned station but additional development, a hotel, new businesses, all on land he's been quietly acquiring. Ethan frowned. "Including where the church stand stood?" Faith nodded. "The church property would be ideal for the hotel they're planning. It's on high ground with a view of the mountains." "Has Campbell made any offers to buy the church land?" According to Mr. Jenkins, he approached the church council last month, but Reverend Collins refused to even consider it. Said the church wasn't for sale at any price. Faith sat on the edge of her desk, facing Ethan. "What about you? Did you learn anything?" "Maybe." Ethan straightened. "I spoke with Tom Whitaker at the livery. He mentioned seeing someone near the church late that afternoon, just before sunset. Didn't recognize them, said they were wearing a long coat despite the heat, with a hat pulled low." "That's suspicious." "It gets more interesting. I also talked to Mrs. Lopez. She remembered that the back door was open when they first arrived at the church. She specifically mentioned it because Reverend Collins had asked them to make sure all doors were securely locked when they left, as there had been some vandalism recently." Faith's eyes widened. "Vandalism? What kind?" "Nothing major, according to Mrs. Lopez. Some broken windows, items moved around inside. The Reverend thought it was probably local boys causing mischief. Or someone exploring the building, learning its layout," Faith suggested. "My thoughts exactly." Ethan moved closer to her desk. "I think whoever set the fire had been planning it for some time. They knew you would all be there that evening. They knew the layout of the church, and they made sure to block the back exit." Faith shuddered slightly. "It's chilling to think someone hated us or the church enough to plan such a thing." "I don't think it was hate," Ethan said slowly. "I think it was business, cold, calculating business. You believe Mr. Campbell burned down the church for a hotel site?" Faith sounded incredulous. "That's monstrous. People have done worse for money," Ethan replied grimly. "But we need proof before we take this to the sheriff. Campbell's a powerful man in this town. His word against ours won't be enough." Faith was silent for a moment, thinking. "The letter we found," she said finally. "If we could match the handwriting to something Campbell wrote." "Good thinking. Do you have anything with his handwriting?" "Not with me, but there should be documents at the bank. Loan agreements, property deeds." Ethan nodded. "We need to see those papers. Can you get access to them?" "Not legally," Faith admitted, but Mr. Jenkins seemed sympathetic. Perhaps he could be persuaded to help us. It's worth trying, Ethan agreed, but carefully, if Campbell's suspects were investigating him. I understand the risk, Mr. North. Faith stood, bringing herself closer to him. 5 women nearly died in that fire. I was one of them. I'm willing to take some chances to see justice done. Ethan found himself admiring her courage even as he worried for her safety. We'll do this together, he said firmly. Tomorrow evening after the bank closes, I'll meet you there. Faith nodded, then glanced at the classroom windows where the afternoon light was beginning to fade. It's getting late. I should head home before dark. I'll walk with you, Ethan offered, surprised by his own words. A small smile touched Faith's lips. That's very gallant of you, Mr. North. Ethan, he reminded her. After facing a burning church together, I think we can dispense with formalities. Ethan, she repeated, and something in the way she said his name made his heart beat just a little faster. And you must call me Faith. Faith, he echoed, testing the feel of her name on his tongue. It suited her, simple, strong, unwavering. They left the schoolhouse together, walking side by side down Douglas's Main Street as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. People nodded greetings as they passed, some looking curiously at the unexpected pairing of the reclusive rancher and the proper schoolteacher. Where exactly do you live? Ethan asked, realizing he didn't know. I have rooms above the millinery shop, Faith replied. Mrs. Thornton, the owner, rents them to me at a very reasonable rate. And before Douglas, where was home then? Boston, originally. I came west 3 years ago after my parents passed. There was nothing left for me there, and the Western territories were desperate for teachers. She glanced up at him. What about you? Have you always lived in Arizona, born in Texas? Ethan said. My father moved us here when I was 10, started the ranch with just 20 head of cattle, built it into something substantial before he died. I've been running it alone for the past 5 years. No brothers or sisters? A sister. She married a banker in San Francisco. I don't see her much. They had reached the millinery shop, a neat establishment with fashionable hats displayed in the window. Faith paused at the side entrance that presumably led to her rooms. Thank you for the escort, she said, and for your help with the investigation. I know you must have many demands on your time. Ethan nodded, suddenly reluctant to leave. Tomorrow evening, then, at the bank. I'll be there. Faith hesitated, then added, Be careful, Ethan. Whoever did this is still out there, and they know we're asking questions. I'm always careful, he assured her, tipping his hat. Good night, Faith. Good night, Ethan. As he walked back to where he'd left Diablo, Ethan found himself thinking not about arson or land deals, but about the way the fading sunlight had gilded Faith's hair and the quiet strength in her blue eyes. It was a distraction he couldn't afford, yet he couldn't seem to banish her from his thoughts, even as he rode back to his ranch through the gathering darkness. The next evening, Ethan arrived at the bank just as Mr. Jenkins was locking the front door. The clerk, a thin man with spectacles and a nervous disposition, started at Ethan's approach. Mr. North, he stammered. The bank is closed for the day. I'm not here for banking, Ethan replied quietly. Miss Garrett should be joining me shortly. Understanding dawned in the clerk's eyes. Ah, yes, she mentioned you might. That is, she asked if I could assist with a certain matter, and can you? Ethan asked directly. Jenkins glanced around the empty street, then nodded quickly. Follow me. We'll use the side entrance. They walked around to a small door at the side of the bank building. Jenkins unlocked it and ushered Ethan inside, into a narrow hallway that led to the bank's offices. Wait here, the clerk whispered. I'll watch for Miss Garrett. Ethan stood in the dim hallway, listening to the sounds of the building settling around him. A few minutes later, Jenkins returned with Faith in tow. She had exchanged her teaching clothes for a simpler dress and had wrapped a shawl around her shoulders despite the warm evening. "Thank you for this, Mr. Jenkins," she said softly. "We won't take long." The clerk nervously adjusted his spectacles. "Mr. Campbell's office is this way. He keeps all important documents in his safe, but many files are in the cabinets." He led them to a well-appointed office at the rear of the bank. A large desk dominated the space, with filing cabinets against one wall and a painting of the Arizona desert on another. Behind the desk was a substantial safe. "I'll leave you to it," Jenkins said, "but please be quick. If anyone sees the lamps lit at this hour—" "We understand," Ethan assured him. "Thank you." Once the clerk had gone, Faith immediately moved to the filing cabinets. "Let's start with property records," she suggested, pulling open a drawer. Ethan joined her, and they worked efficiently, searching through neatly labeled folders for anything related to the church property or the planned railroad development. Faith found a folder containing correspondence between Campbell and the railroad executives, confirming their discussions about the hotel project. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a paragraph in one letter. They specifically mentioned the excellent site currently occupied by the church and Campbell's assurances that he could resolve that particular obstacle. "Damning," Ethan agreed, "but not proof he set the fire." He continued searching through the files, finally pulling out a thin folder labeled Church Property. Inside was a draft offer to purchase the church land for a sum that, while generous, was well below what the property would be worth once the railroad arrived. More significantly, there was a letter from Reverend Collins declining the offer in firm terms, suggesting that Campbell's interest in the property seemed motivated by something other than the good of the community. "The Reverend suspected Campbell's plans," Faith murmured as she read the letter. "And made himself an obstacle," Ethan added grimly. Faith pulled out the charred letter fragment they had found in the hymnal. "Let's compare the handwriting." They laid the fragment beside a letter Campbell had signed, and even to their untrained eyes, the similarities were striking: the distinctive loop of the Y's, the sharp angle of the T crosses. "It's the same hand," Faith said with certainty. "Campbell wrote that threatening letter to the Reverend. And when threats didn't work, he resorted to more direct methods," Ethan concluded. The sound of a door opening somewhere in the bank made them both freeze. Hurriedly, they replaced the files, making sure everything was as they had found it. Faith slipped the charred letter fragment into her pocket. "Time to go," Ethan whispered, extinguishing the lamp they had been using. They moved quietly back to the hallway, but before they could reach the side door, a voice called out, "Who's there?" It was Campbell himself, his bulky silhouette visible at the end of the hall. Without hesitation, Ethan pushed Faith toward the exit. "Go," he urged. "I'll handle this." "I won't leave you," she protested. "You have the evidence. Get to the sheriff." When she still hesitated, he added more forcefully, "Now, Faith." Finally, she nodded and slipped out the side door. Ethan turned to face Campbell, who was approaching with a lamp held high. "North," Campbell said in surprise. "What the devil are you doing in my bank after hours?" Ethan thought quickly. "Looking for you, actually. Your clerk said you might still be working." "At this hour, through the side entrance." Campbell's voice was heavy with skepticism. "Do you take me for a fool, North?" "Not at all," Ethan replied evenly. "But I do take you for an arsonist and would-be murderer." Campbell's face hardened. "That's a serious accusation, one you can't possibly prove." "Can I?" Ethan took a step closer. "We found the letter you wrote to Reverend Collins. We know about your deal with the railroad, and how the church property was the one piece of land you couldn't acquire legally." For a moment, Campbell's composure slipped, a flash of panic crossing his features before he mastered himself. Preposterous. I was in Tucson when that unfortunate fire occurred. Were you, or did you pay someone to say you were? Ethan took another step. How much is a hotel worth to you, Campbell? Enough to burn down a church with women inside. Enough to commit murder. Campbell's hand moved suddenly, and Ethan saw the glint of metal as the banker pulled a derringer from his vest pocket. "Step back, North," Campbell ordered, his voice steady despite the sweat beading on his forehead. "I won't let you ruin everything I've worked for." Ethan eyed the small pistol. "So it is true. You did set the fire." "I didn't intend for anyone to get hurt," Campbell said, his tone almost defensive. "They weren't supposed to be there that late. It was just business. The town needs that hotel more than it needs another church." "5 women nearly died," Ethan reminded him coldly. "An unfortunate complication," Campbell replied, gesturing with the derringer. "Now I think it's time for you to leave North. Leave Douglas entirely. Your ranch would fetch a good price in the current market." Ethan tensed, preparing to lunge for the gun. Before he could move, the main door of the bank burst open and Sheriff Wilkins entered, his revolver drawn. Behind him was Faith, her face pale but determined. "Drop the gun, Campbell," the sheriff ordered. "It's over." Campbell's eyes darted between the sheriff and Ethan, calculating his chances. For a terrible moment, Ethan thought he might fire anyway, but then the banker's shoulders slumped, and he lowered the derringer. "You don't understand," Campbell said, his voice suddenly tired. "The railroad would have bypassed Douglas entirely without the hotel deal. The town would have died. So you decided to kill part of it yourself?" the sheriff asked as he moved forward to take the derringer. "You're under arrest for arson, attempted murder, and whatever else I can think of by the time we reach the jail." As the sheriff led Campbell away, Faith rushed to Ethan's side. "Are you hurt? I came as quickly as I could." "I'm fine," Ethan assured her, suddenly aware of how close she was standing. "You did the right thing." Faith's blue eyes searched his face, as if confirming for herself that he was indeed unharmed. "I was so afraid he'd—" she stopped, unable to complete the thought. Impulsively, Ethan reached out and took her hand. It was trembling slightly, and he held it firmly in his own. "It's over now," she nodded, her eyes not leaving his. For a long moment, they stood there in the dim hallway, connected by their clasped hands and the shared understanding of how close they had both come to tragedy. Finally, Faith gently withdrew her hand. "We should go. The sheriff will want our statements." Ethan nodded, feeling the loss of her touch keenly. "After you," he said, gesturing toward the door. As they stepped out into the night air, Ethan found himself wondering what would happen next. The mystery was solved. Justice would be served, but where did that leave them? Two people who, a week ago, had barely acknowledged each other's existence, now bound by shared danger and something else, something neither of them had yet dared to name. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity in Douglas. Campbell's arrest sent shockwaves through the community, especially when the full extent of his crimes became known. Not only had he orchestrated the church fire, but he had also been embezzling from the bank for years to finance his property acquisitions. The railroad representatives, upon learning of Campbell's methods, were quick to distance themselves from him, though they confirmed their intentions to build a spur line to Douglas. The town council, led by Mayor Harrison, began negotiations to ensure the development would benefit the entire community, not just wealthy investors. Meanwhile, plans for rebuilding the church proceeded with renewed enthusiasm. A temporary structure was erected on the original site, and donations poured in from across the territory. Through it all, Ethan found himself spending more time in town than he had in years, ostensibly to assist with the rebuilding efforts, but in reality, drawn by the presence of one particular schoolteacher. Faith, for her part, seemed equally inclined to seek out his company, often finding reasons to consult him on matters related to the church reconstruction. It was after one such consultation, as they walked together through Douglas in the golden light of late afternoon, that Ethan finally gave voice to the question that had been on his mind. "What happens now?" he asked, pausing at the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open country. Faith looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. "The church will be rebuilt, Campbell will face justice, life in Douglas will go on." "That's not what I meant," Ethan said quietly. A soft blush colored Faith's cheeks. "I know it's not." They stood in silence for a moment, the warm breeze carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. "I've enjoyed working with you, Ethan," Faith finally said, "more than I expected to. As have I." Ethan turned to face her fully. "But the case is solved. The danger is past. There's no reason for us to keep consulting with each other." "No practical reason," Faith agreed, her blue eyes meeting his. Unless, Ethan prompted when she didn't continue. Faith took a deep breath. "Unless we wish to. For reasons that have nothing to do with burning churches or land schemes." Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, hope, mixed with a fear he hadn't experienced since facing the inferno that had brought them together. "And do you wish to, Faith?" Instead of answering directly, Faith asked, "Why did you ride into that fire, Ethan? You didn't know who was trapped inside. You didn't owe us anything." "It was the right thing to do," he replied automatically. Faith shook her head slightly. "Many men know what the right thing is. Few risk their lives to do it." Ethan looked away, uncomfortable with her praise. "I didn't think about it, I just acted. That's what makes it remarkable." Faith stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of darker blue in her eyes. "You're a good man, Ethan North. Better than you give yourself credit for." "I'm just a rancher," he said, even as his heart raced at her proximity. "You're more than that to me." Faith's voice was barely above a whisper now. "You have been since the moment you came through that window of fire." Ethan couldn't find words to respond. Instead, he slowly, giving her time to step away if she wished, reached out and touched her cheek. Her skin was soft beneath his calloused fingers, and she leaned slightly into his touch. "I'd like to call on you properly," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "If you'd permit it." Faith's smile was like the sunrise. "I'd be disappointed if you didn't." The sound of approaching riders interrupted the moment. They stepped apart as Sheriff Wilkins and two deputies rode past, nodding greetings on their way out of town. "Sunday," Ethan said once they were alone again. "After church service, we could have dinner together." "I'd like that very much," Faith replied, her smile warming him more than the afternoon sun. As they walked back toward town, Ethan felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. The woman beside him, with her quiet strength and unwavering principles, had somehow broken through the solitude he had built around himself since his father's death. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, but for the first time in a very long time, he was eager to find out. Sunday arrived with clear skies, and a sense of anticipation that had nothing to do with the temporary church service and everything to do with the dinner that would follow. Ethan, dressed in his best shirt and newly polished boots, sat at the back of the crowded tent that served as a makeshift sanctuary, his eyes frequently drifting to where Faith sat with the other teachers near the front. The service was heartfelt, focused on themes of resilience and rebirth. Reverend Collins, who had been away visiting his daughter when the fire occurred, spoke movingly about the strength of the community and the miraculous rescue that had prevented tragedy. "We are reminded," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the tent, that God often works through the courage of ordinary people. When Ethan North rode into that burning building, he demonstrated the highest form of love, the willingness to lay down one's life for others. Ethan shifted uncomfortably as heads turned in his direction. He had never sought recognition for what he'd done, and the attention made him uneasy. After the service, as people mingled outside the tent, Faith made her way to his side. She wore a dress he hadn't seen before, a soft blue that matched her eyes, with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. "You look uncomfortable with the praise," she observed, a hint of amusement in her voice. "I prefer actions to words," Ethan replied, "especially when the words are about me." Faith laughed softly. "I've noticed. Are you ready for dinner? Mrs. Thornton has kindly offered us the use of her parlor, since my rooms are rather small for entertaining." The meal was simple but delicious: roast chicken, fresh bread, and vegetables from Mrs. Thornton's garden. The milliner herself made a brief appearance to serve the food, then tactfully withdrew, leaving Ethan and Faith to dine alone in the cozy parlor. Their conversation flowed easily, moving from Douglas's history to books they had both read to memories of their childhoods, his on the open ranges of Texas, hers in the bustling streets of Boston. How does a refined Boston lady end up teaching in a frontier town? Ethan asked as they finished their meal. Faith's expression turned reflective. "After my parents died, influenza took them both within a week of each other. I found myself at a crossroads. I had been teaching at a girls' school in Boston, but with my parents gone, there was nothing holding me there. I saw an advertisement seeking teachers for the Western Territories, and something about it called to me." "Weren't you afraid, coming all this way alone?" "Terrified," Faith admitted with a small smile, "but also exhilarated. I wanted to be somewhere I could make a real difference, somewhere my work truly mattered." "And does it matter?" Ethan asked. "Every day," Faith replied without hesitation. "When I see a child grasp a new concept, when former students return to tell me they're continuing their education or starting businesses. Yes, it matters tremendously." Ethan found himself envying her certainty, her clear sense of purpose. "My father wanted the ranch to matter," he said slowly. "He had visions of building something that would last generations, but sometimes I wonder if I'm just maintaining something rather than building it." Faith studied him thoughtfully. "What would you build if you could choose?" It was a question no one had ever asked him before, and Ethan found himself considering it seriously. "I've thought about breeding horses," he admitted. "Not just for ranch work, but quality stock that could command good prices. Diablo has bloodlines that could be the foundation of something special." "Why haven't you?" "Time, money, risk," Ethan shrugged. "The cattle operation is stable, predictable. Horses would be a gamble, but one you'd enjoy." "Yes," he acknowledged, surprised by his own candor, "I would." Faith reached across the table and briefly touched his hand. "Then perhaps it's time to build something of your own, rather than just maintaining your father's legacy." The simple gesture and her words of encouragement affected Ethan more deeply than he would have expected. This woman, who had known him for barely 2 weeks, seemed to understand aspects of himself he had never fully articulated. As the afternoon lengthened into evening, they moved from the dining table to sit beside each other on Mrs. Thornton's small sofa. Their conversation continued, touching on dreams and disappointments, hopes for the future, the changing nature of the territory as railroads and Eastern influences pushed westward. "Douglas will be different when the railroad comes," Faith observed. "Not necessarily worse, but changed." "All things change," Ethan replied. "It's fighting against that truth that causes suffering." Faith looked at him with new interest. "That sounds almost philosophical, Mr. North." "Don't tell anyone," he said with a rare smile. It would ruin my reputation as a simple cattleman. When it was finally time for him to leave, Ethan found himself reluctant to end the evening. They stood at the door, the moment stretching between them like a fragile thread. "I've enjoyed today immensely," Faith said softly, "as have I." Ethan hesitated, then added, "I'd like to see you again." "Soon." "I'd like that too." Faith's gaze met his, steady and clear. "Very much." Impulsively, Ethan took her hand and raised it to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. He felt her slight intake of breath, saw the way her eyes widened momentarily. "Good night, Faith," he said, releasing her hand reluctantly. "Good night, Ethan," she replied, her voice a touch breathless. As he rode back to his ranch under a canopy of stars, Ethan felt a sense of possibility he hadn't experienced in years. The woman he had left behind in town had awakened something in him, something he had thought long dormant, if not dead. He found himself smiling into the darkness, already planning when he would see her again. Over the following weeks, Ethan and Faith fell into a rhythm of regular meetings. He would come to town for Sunday services, after which they would share a meal and conversation. Sometimes they would walk along the creek that ran behind Douglas, or ride together in the hills surrounding the town. Occasionally, Faith would accompany him to his ranch, where he showed her his operations and introduced her to the horses he hoped would form the foundation of his breeding program. As summer deepened into autumn, their feelings for each other grew more evident, though neither had yet put them into words. The town noticed their courtship with interest and, for the most part, approval. The heroic rancher and the respected schoolteacher made a fitting pair in the eyes of Douglas's citizens. The new church was rising rapidly, its frame already complete and its walls beginning to take shape. Ethan had contributed generously to the rebuilding fund and often lent his physical labor to the construction efforts. Faith organized the children to create decorations for the eventual consecration ceremony, planned for Christmas Eve. It was during one such workday at the church site, as Ethan helped raise a heavy beam into place, that Sheriff Wilkins approached him with news. "Campbell's trial is set for next month in Tucson," the sheriff informed him once the beam was secure. "The prosecutor wants both you and Miss Garrett to testify." Ethan wiped sweat from his brow. "We'll be there." "There's something else you should know." Wilkins glanced around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "Campbell's been making threats. Says when he gets out, he'll make those responsible pay." "He won't be getting out for a long time, if ever," Ethan pointed out. "True enough, but he has friends, business associates who lost money when his schemes collapsed. Just keep your eyes open." Ethan nodded grimly. "I always do. And I'll make sure Faith is aware too." That evening, as they sat on the porch of Faith's building watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ethan relayed the sheriff's warning. "I'm not afraid," Faith said after he finished. "Campbell is desperate and angry, but he's behind bars where he can't harm anyone." "His associates aren't," Ethan reminded her. "Just promise me you'll be cautious. Don't go anywhere alone after dark. Keep your doors locked." Faith placed her hand over his where it rested on the porch railing. "I promise. But you must do the same. You're as much a target as I am, more so, perhaps." Ethan turned his hand to clasp hers. "I've spent most of my life looking over my shoulder. It's second nature in ranch country." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the eastern sky. Faith's hand remained in his, a small point of warmth that anchored him to the moment. "Ethan," she said eventually, her voice thoughtful, "what do you want from life, truly?" The question caught him by surprise. "What brings this to mind?" "I've been thinking about the future, about choices and paths taken or not taken." She looked at him, her expression serious in the fading light. "I came west seeking purpose, and I found it in teaching. But lately, I've been wondering if there might be more." Ethan felt his heart rate increase. "More," Faith nodded slowly. "The fire changed something in me. Facing death like that, it makes you evaluate what truly matters." "And what matters to you, Faith?" Ethan asked quietly. She turned fully toward him, her blue eyes luminous in the twilight. "Connection, purpose, love." She paused, then added softly, "You." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, profound in its honesty. Ethan found himself momentarily speechless, overwhelmed by the gift of her trust and affection. When he didn't immediately respond, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Faith's face. "Perhaps I've spoken too boldly." "No," Ethan interrupted, finding his voice at last. "No, you haven't." He took both her hands in his. "Faith, I came to Douglas 3 months ago a solitary man, content with my isolation. I hadn't realized how empty that existence was until I met you." He paused, searching for words adequate to express feelings that were still new and somewhat frightening in their intensity. "You matter to me more than I can say. When I think of the future now, I can't imagine it without you in it." Faith's smile was radiant, even in the growing darkness. "Then we're in agreement on that point." Ethan released her hands only to gently cup her face. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he leaned forward until his lips met hers in a kiss that began tenderly but quickly deepened as she responded with equal fervor. When they finally parted, both somewhat breathless, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Faith Garrett," he whispered. "I think I have since I first saw you in that burning church, refusing to leave until everyone else was safe." "And I love you, Ethan North," she replied softly. "My brave, honorable cowboy who rode through fire to save us all." In that moment, on a simple porch in a frontier town, with the stars emerging overhead and the distant sounds of Douglas settling into evening, Ethan felt a sense of completion he had never known before. Whatever the future held Campbell's threats, the changing territory, the challenges of merging two independent lives, they would face it together, strengthened by a love that had been forged in fire and tempered by shared purpose. The weeks leading up to Campbell's trial passed swiftly. Ethan and Faith's courtship became more openly acknowledged, with Ethan frequently escorting her to town events and Faith occasionally spending weekends at the North Ranch, chaperoned by Ethan's housekeeper, Mrs. Morales. As the date of their departure for Tucson approached, Ethan found himself increasingly concerned about Campbell's threats. He arranged for extra hands to watch over his ranch during his absence, and insisted that Faith stay with him at a reputable hotel in Tucson, rather than finding separate accommodations. "People will talk," Faith warned him as they boarded the stage to Tucson, though her tone suggested she wasn't particularly troubled by the prospect. "Let them," Ethan replied, helping her into the coach. "Your safety matters more than gossip." The journey to Tucson was long but uneventful, the stagecoach making good time along the well-traveled road. They arrived late in the evening, checked into adjacent rooms at the Palace Hotel, and agreed to meet for breakfast before reporting to the courthouse in the morning. The trial itself was straightforward. The evidence against Campbell was overwhelming, and both Ethan and Faith testified clearly about what they had discovered. Campbell glared at them throughout their testimony, his once prosperous appearance now diminished by months in jail. When the verdict was announced guilty on all counts, with a sentence of 20 years in territorial prison, Campbell lunged toward Ethan and Faith, shouting threats before being restrained by court officers. "This isn't over," he yelled as he was dragged away. "You'll pay for this, North." Both of you. Outside the courthouse, Faith was visibly shaken by the outburst. "He truly hates us," she murmured as Ethan led her away from the crowd of spectators. "He hates that his plans were thwarted," Ethan corrected her, "but he's going to prison for a very long time. By the time he gets out, if he ever does, will be distant memories." Faith nodded, but her usual confidence seemed dimmed. Ethan squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Let's get some lunch," he suggested. "Then we can explore a bit before heading back tomorrow." They spent the afternoon wandering through Tucson's streets, admiring the blend of Mexican and American architecture and browsing in shops far more extensive than those available in Douglas. By evening, Faith's spirits had recovered, and they enjoyed a pleasant dinner at the hotel's restaurant. As they finished their meal, Ethan reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "I had planned to do this back in Douglas," he said, suddenly nervous, "but being here away from everyday concerns, it feels right." Faith's eyes widened as she realized what was happening. "Ethan." He opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant ring, a small diamond flanked by 2 sapphires that matched the color of her eyes. "Faith Garrett, I love you. I want to spend my life with you, build a future together. Will you marry me?" Tears sprang to Faith's eyes. "Yes," she whispered, then more firmly, "Yes, Ethan, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger where it fit perfectly. Faith admired it for a moment, then leaned across the table to kiss him, heedless of the other diners who smiled indulgently at the obvious display of affection. "When?" she asked as they walked back to their rooms, her hand firmly clasped in his, the ring a new weight she was already growing accustomed to. "I thought perhaps Christmas Eve," Ethan suggested. "After the new church is consecrated, it seems fitting somehow." Faith's smile was luminous. "Perfect. A new beginning for the church and for us." They returned to Douglas the following day to find the town buzzing with news of Campbell's conviction. Their engagement added another layer of excitement, with well-wishers stopping them at every turn to offer congratulations. Preparations for both the church consecration and their wedding proceeded rapidly. Faith continued teaching, though she had decided this would be her last term. After their marriage, she planned to establish a small school at the ranch for the children of Ethan's workers and neighboring homesteaders. Ethan, meanwhile, began implementing his plans for horse breeding in earnest, acquiring 2 additional mares with bloodlines that complemented Diablo's. With Faith's encouragement, he hired more hands to manage the cattle operation, freeing his time for the horses and for planning their future together. As December arrived, bringing cooler temperatures but little snow to the high desert, the new church stood complete. It was larger than its predecessor, built of adobe and stone rather than wood, with tall windows that filled the interior with light. The bell that had been salvaged from the ruins of the old church was installed in the new bell tower, its clear tones once again calling the faithful to worship. A week before Christmas, as Ethan and Faith were finalizing plans for their wedding, Sheriff Wilkins rode out to the North Ranch with troubling news. Campbell escaped during a prisoner transfer, he announced grimly when Ethan met him at the gate. Killed a guard and disappeared into the mountains south of Tucson. Ethan's blood ran cold. How long ago? 3 days. They kept it quiet at first, hoping to recapture him quickly. The sheriff shifted in his saddle. "I've posted deputies in town, and I'd advise you to stay close to home, keep your men alert. Campbell made it clear you were his primary target, and Faith, she's in town at the school. I've assigned a deputy to watch over her. She's safe for now." Wilkins hesitated. "But you might consider postponing the wedding, at least until Campbell is recaptured." Ethan shook his head firmly. "We won't let him dictate our lives. The wedding will proceed as planned." After the sheriff departed, Ethan immediately rode to town to see Faith. He found her at the schoolhouse, supervising the children as they practiced Christmas carols for the upcoming service. When the last child had departed, he told her about Campbell's escape. Faith listened calmly, though her hand tightened around his as he spoke. "What do you think he'll do?" she asked when Ethan had finished. "If he's smart, he'll head for Mexico and never look back. But Campbell's pride was deeply wounded. I think he'll try to fulfill his threats." Faith nodded slowly. "We should proceed as if he will, take precautions but not allow fear to rule us." Ethan marveled at her composure. "You're not afraid?" "Of course I am," she admitted. "But I refuse to let that man steal any more from us than he already has. We'll have our wedding on Christmas Eve as planned. We'll just be vigilant." Over the next few days, Ethan divided his time between the ranch and town, unwilling to let Faith out of his sight for long. The sheriff organized patrols, and Ethan's ranch hands took turns standing watch through the night. The entire community of Douglas seemed on edge, the joy of the approaching holiday season tempered by the knowledge that a dangerous man with a vendetta was at large. Christmas Eve dawned clear and cold, the desert air crisp with the promise of a beautiful day. The church consecration was scheduled for noon, with Ethan and Faith's wedding to follow immediately after. By mid-morning, people from miles around were streaming into Douglas for the dual celebration. Ethan spent the morning at the ranch, dressing in his best suit and trying to quell the mix of emotions churning within him: joy at the prospect of making Faith his wife, anxiety about Campbell's threats, and a deeper, more personal fear that he might somehow fail to be the husband Faith deserved. As he prepared to ride into town, his foreman, Miguel, approached with a worried expression. "Rider coming fast from the south," he reported. "Looks like he's in a hurry." Ethan grabbed his rifle and joined Miguel at the ranch gate. The approaching rider was indeed pushing his horse hard, and as he drew nearer, Ethan recognized one of Sheriff Wilkins's deputies. "North," the man called as he reined in his lathered horse. "Campbell's been spotted near Douglas. Sheriff sent men to search the surrounding hills, but he wanted you warned right away." "Faith," Ethan said immediately. "Where is she?" "At the millinery shop, getting ready for the wedding. The sheriff posted 2 men outside." Ethan nodded grimly. "Tell him I'm coming into town now. And send men to check all approaches to the church. Campbell might try something during the ceremony." The deputy rode off, and Ethan quickly mounted Diablo. As he galloped toward Douglas, his mind raced through possibilities. Campbell was many things: arrogant, greedy, ruthless, but he wasn't stupid. A frontal assault on a church full of people, many of them armed, would be suicidal. No, Campbell would be more cunning. He would strike when least expected, perhaps targeting Faith when she was vulnerable. Or he might seek to recreate his original crime: another fire, another attempt to destroy what the town had rebuilt. By the time Ethan reached Douglas, the streets were crowded with people heading toward the new church. He made his way directly to the millinery shop, where he found the promised deputies standing guard outside. "Any sign of trouble?" he asked them. "None, sir. Miss Garrett's inside with Mrs. Thornton and some other ladies, getting ready." Ethan nodded, relieved but still uneasy. "Keep your eyes open. Campbell could be anywhere." He continued to the church, where Sheriff Wilkins was organizing additional men to patrol the perimeter during the ceremonies. The interior was already filling with townspeople, the pews decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons for Christmas. "Any word?" Ethan asked the sheriff. Wilkins shook his head. "Nothing definite. A prospector thought he saw someone matching Campbell's description near Eagle Creek this morning, but it could have been anyone." Ethan scanned the church interior and exterior with a critical eye. "He'll try something," he said with certainty. "The question is what and when. "We're as prepared as we can be," the sheriff assured him. "Try to focus on your wedding, North. Don't let Campbell steal that from you, too." The consecration ceremony began precisely at noon, with Reverend Collins leading the congregation in prayers of dedication for the new church. Ethan stood near the front, his eyes constantly moving, watching for any sign of danger. Faith had not yet arrived. Tradition dictated that the bride would come separately for the wedding ceremony, and Ethan found himself growing increasingly anxious as the consecration proceeded. The deputies had assured him she was safe, but until he saw her with his own eyes, the knot in his stomach would not ease. As the consecration concluded, people began to rearrange themselves for the wedding. Ethan moved to the front of the church, where he would await his bride. The organist began playing softly, and the atmosphere shifted from solemn reverence to joyful anticipation. And then, from outside, came the sound of shouting. Ethan was moving before anyone else had fully registered the commotion. He pushed through the crowd to the church doors, the sheriff close behind him. Outside, one of the deputies who had been guarding Faith was stumbling up the church steps, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "Campbell," the man gasped when he saw Ethan. "He took her, knocked us out," heading east toward the old silver mine. The world seemed to stop for Ethan. Faith. Campbell had faith. Every nightmare scenario he had imagined paled in comparison to the reality. "How long ago?" he demanded, already running toward where Diablo was hitched. 10 minutes, maybe 15, the deputy called after him. "He's on foot, dragging her with him." Ethan vaulted into the saddle, wheeling Diablo toward the eastern hills where the abandoned silver mine lay. Behind him, he was dimly aware of the sheriff organizing a posse, but he didn't wait. Every second counted now. The old silver mine was 3 miles east of Douglas, in rocky terrain that was difficult to navigate on horseback. Ethan pushed Diablo as hard as he dared, following the faint trail that led into the hills. His mind was a storm of fear and fury, images of Faith at Campbell's mercy driving him forward with reckless speed. He had nearly reached the mine entrance when a gunshot rang out, the bullet striking the ground near Diablo's hooves. The horse reared, and Ethan fought to control him as a voice called from the rocks above. "That's far enough, North. The next one goes through your head." Campbell stood on a rocky outcrop about 50 yards ahead, a revolver in his hand. Beside him, her hands bound and a cloth tied around her mouth, was Faith. Her wedding dress was torn and dirty, but her eyes, when they met Ethan's, were fierce with defiance rather than fear. "Let her go, Campbell," Ethan called, easing Diablo forward despite the threat of the gun. "It's me you want." Campbell laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You're right about that, but she's my insurance. Get down from that horse and drop your weapons, or the schoolteacher dies right now." Ethan slowly dismounted, keeping his eyes on Campbell and Faith. He removed his revolver and laid it on the ground, then his rifle from its saddle scabbard. "That's better," Campbell said. "Now, we're going to have a little talk about justice, North, about how you and your woman here cost me everything I'd worked for." "You cost yourself everything when you decided to burn down a church with people inside," Ethan replied, taking another step forward. "That was your choice, Campbell. I told you before they weren't supposed to be there." Campbell's voice rose in anger. "It was just supposed to be an empty building. Bad timing, that's all." "And bad timing is why you're here now," Ethan said, taking another cautious step. "If you'd just taken your prison sentence, you'd be alive 20 years from now. But this ends only one way." Campbell's face contorted with rage. "For you, maybe. I'll be long gone before that posse of yours gets here." "You won't make it to the border," Ethan warned, edging closer. "Every lawman in the territory will be looking for you, Enough talk. Campbell pressed the gun to Faith's temple. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to watch your bride-to-be die. Then I'm going to kill you. Then I'll take your horse and be in Mexico before sundown. Faith's eyes locked with Ethan's, and in that moment of silent communication, he understood what she was about to do. He tensed, ready to move the instant she did. With a sudden, violent movement, Faith drove her elbow back into Campbell's stomach. The banker doubled over, the gun wavering, and Faith threw herself to the ground, rolling away from him. Ethan lunged forward, covering the distance between them in a few desperate strides. Campbell recovered enough to aim the gun at him, but Ethan was already upon him, tackling the banker to the rocky ground. They grappled for control of the weapon, each man fighting with the knowledge that his life depended on the outcome. Campbell was heavier but soft from years behind a desk. Ethan was leaner, hardened by a lifetime of ranch work. They rolled across the rocks, the gun between them, fingers struggling for the trigger, the revolver discharged with a deafening crack. For a moment, both men froze. Then Campbell's grip loosened, and Ethan saw the spreading red stain on the banker's shirt. The bullet had found its mark. Not fair. Campbell gasped, his eyes already glazing. My town, my future. It was never yours, Ethan told him as the light faded from the man's eyes. Douglas belongs to all who live there, not just the wealthy or powerful. He wasn't sure if Campbell heard him. The banker's body went slack, his last breath escaping in a soft sigh that seemed to carry away all the malice and greed that had driven him. Ethan immediately turned to Faith, who had managed to sit up despite her bound hands. He quickly removed the gag and untied her wrists, his hands gentle despite their trembling. "Are you hurt?" he asked, helping her to her feet and examining her for injuries. "Just scratches and bruises," she assured him, though her voice shook slightly. "He surprised us as we were leaving Mrs. Thornton's. Knocked the deputies unconscious and forced me to come with him. He was unhinged, Ethan, talking about justice and vengeance the entire way." Ethan pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as the reality that he might have lost her forever washed over him. "I was so afraid," he whispered against her hair, "when I heard he had taken you." Faith clung to him, her body trembling with delayed shock. "I knew you would come," she said softly. "I never doubted it for a moment." The sound of approaching riders interrupted their reunion. Sheriff Wilkins and his posse crested the hill, weapons drawn, only to pull up short at the sight before them, Campbell's body on the rocks and Ethan and Faith locked in a desperate embrace. "Is it over?" the sheriff called as he dismounted. Ethan nodded, still holding Faith close. "It's over." Campbell drew on me, we struggled for the gun, and he glanced at the body. "He won't trouble anyone again." The sheriff examined Campbell briefly, then turned to Faith. "Are you all right, Miss Garrett?" "I will be," she replied, straightening her shoulders despite her torn and soiled wedding dress. "But I believe I'm late for my wedding." A ripple of surprised laughter went through the posse at her composure. Ethan looked down at her with a mixture of pride and concern. "Are you sure?" "After everything that's happened," Faith placed her hand against his cheek. "I have waited 3 months to become your wife, Ethan North. I will not allow Harold Campbell to delay it a moment longer." The return to Douglas was slow, with Faith riding double with Ethan on Diablo. By the time they reached the church, word of what had happened had spread throughout the town. The entire congregation was waiting, spilling out onto the steps and the street beyond. A cheer went up as they appeared, dusty and disheveled but alive and together. Mrs. Thornton rushed forward with a spare dress for Faith, and several women ushered her away to help her change. Ethan, after assuring concerned townspeople that he was unharmed, cleaned himself up as best he could, and resumed his place at the front of the church. When Faith reappeared 30 minutes later, she wore a simple but elegant blue dress rather than her ruined wedding gown. Her hair had been brushed and repinned, and someone had found flowers to make a small bouquet for her. To Ethan, standing at the altar watching her walk toward him, she had never looked more beautiful. The ceremony itself was brief but deeply meaningful, their vows resonating with special significance after the day's events. When Reverend Collins pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in applause and cheers, the collective relief and joy of the community adding to the couple's own happiness. The celebration that followed was one Douglas would remember for years to come. It was both a wedding reception and a Christmas Eve party, with food and music and dancing that continued well into the night. The new church, consecrated that very day, bore witness to the resilience of the community and the love that had emerged from tragedy. Late that evening, as Ethan and Faith prepared to leave for the ranch that was now their shared home, Mayor Harrison called for silence and raised his glass in a toast. "To Ethan and Faith North," he proclaimed, "whose courage in the face of fire, both literal and figurative, has inspired us all. May their union be blessed with the same strength and devotion they have already shown to each other and to Douglas." "Hear, hear," came the response, glasses raised throughout the room. As they rode away under a canopy of winter stars, Faith nestled against Ethan's chest, her hand resting over his heart. "I never imagined my life would take such a turn," she said softly. "When I came west, I was seeking purpose, but I found so much more." Ethan pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "As did I. For years, I thought my father's ranch was my only legacy, the only future worth pursuing. Now I know it was just the foundation for something far greater." Faith tilted her face up to his, her expression serene despite the day's trauma. "I love you, Ethan North. Today, tomorrow, always." "And I love you, Faith North," he replied, the new name feeling right on his tongue, "with everything I am and everything I will ever be." As they continued toward home, their home, the night was alive with promise and possibility. Behind them lay a past marked by both tragedy and triumph. Ahead stretched a future they would build together, day by day, year by year. A future born in the moment, a cowboy rode through fire to save the women trapped in a burning church at dusk, never knowing that the greatest rescue would be his own heart from the solitude that had imprisoned it for so long. 5 years later, on a bright spring morning, Ethan stood on the porch of the North Ranch house, watching as a small figure on a pony galloped across the corral under Faith's watchful eye. "Look, Papa," called 4-year-old James, his face alight with pride. "I'm riding all by myself." "I see that," Ethan called back, unable to keep the smile from his face. "You're a natural, just like your mother said." Faith guided her own horse alongside their son's pony, her expertise evident in every movement. She had taken to ranch life with surprising ease, adapting her teaching skills to establish a thriving small school for the children of ranch workers and neighboring families. 3 days a week, she taught reading, writing, and arithmetic in the converted bunkhouse. The rest of her time was divided between helping with the horse breeding operation and raising their growing family. James, with his father's dark hair and his mother's blue eyes, had been joined 18 months ago by his sister, Emma, who was currently napping in the nursery under Mrs. Morales's watchful eye. And just last month, Faith had shared the news that a third child would join their family by year's end. The ranch itself had prospered beyond Ethan's most optimistic projections. His horse breeding program had produced animals now sought after throughout the territory, and the cattle operation continued to provide a steady income. New buildings had been added, a larger barn, expanded corrals, comfortable housing for the permanent ranch hands and their families. Douglas, too, had grown. The railroad had indeed come, bringing new businesses and residents. The church where Ethan and Faith had married was now the center of a thriving community, with Reverend Collins still leading its congregation. Sheriff Wilkins had retired last year, but not before training his deputy and Faith's former pupil, young Tom Wilson, to take his place. The events that had brought Ethan and Faith together were not forgotten, but they had receded into the background of daily life, emerging occasionally in quiet conversations or in the town's retelling of its history to newcomers. As Faith and James completed their riding lesson and headed back toward the house, Ethan moved to meet them, lifting his son from the pony and setting him on his shoulders. "Did you see me, Papa? Did you see how fast I went?" James asked, his small hands gripping Ethan's hair for balance. "I certainly did," Ethan assured him. "Soon you'll be outrunning all of us." Faith dismounted gracefully despite the slight swell of her pregnancy, her smile warm as she watched her husband and son. "He has your seat," she told Ethan, "natural and confident." "And your fearlessness," Ethan added, reaching out to take her hand. They walked together toward the house, the horses following docilely behind them. The spring air was sweet with the scent of desert flowers, and in the distance, the mountains stood blue and eternal against the sky. "Are you happy, Faith?" Ethan asked suddenly, the question arising from some deep place of gratitude within him. Faith looked surprised, then thoughtful. "More than happy," she said after a moment. "Content, fulfilled, blessed." She squeezed his hand. "Are you?" Ethan gazed at his wife, then at their son perched on his shoulders, then at the prosperous ranch around them, all of it, a testament to the life they had built together since that fateful day when fire had brought them into each other's paths. "I never knew it was possible to be this happy," he answered truthfully. "Every morning I wake up amazed that this is our life." Faith's eyes glistened with understanding. "From fire to this," she said softly, "it's quite a journey we've made." "And still making," Ethan reminded her, his free hand moving to rest briefly on the gentle curve of her stomach. "Every day." As they reached the house, Emma's voice called from within, awake from her nap and eager to join the family activities. James wiggled to be let down, rushing inside to see his sister. Ethan and Faith followed more slowly, their hands still joined, their steps matched in the comfortable rhythm of two people who had found in each other not just love, but true partnership. The cowboy who had once ridden through fire had found something far more precious than heroism. He had found home. And the schoolteacher who had faced death with courage had discovered that teaching wasn't her only calling. Loving fiercely and building a family was equally her destiny. Together, they had transformed tragedy into triumph, fear into faith, and two separate paths into one shared journey that would continue, day by day, season by season, for all the years of their lives.